The winter wind cut through the cabin walls like invisible knives, finding every crack, every gap in the weathered wood that Martha Hayes had called home for the past 43 years. She sat by the small cast-iron stove, a threadbare quilt wrapped around her shoulders, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air of her own living room. Martha was 72 years old, her hands gnarled from decades of farm work alongside her late husband, Robert. He had been gone for 3 years now, taken by a heart that simply gave out one morning while he was feeding the chickens. The small farm in rural Kentucky had been their dream, their sanctuary, but now it felt more like a prison of memories and mounting disrepair. The cabin sat at the end of a long dirt road, 5 miles from the nearest town of Millbrook. Once, the place had been pristine, with Robert constantly fixing, painting, and maintaining every board and nail. But Martha's pension barely covered food and medicine. There was nothing left for repairs, nothing left for the luxury of warmth. She looked at the walls, seeing the gaps between the logs where the old chinking had crumbled away. Some cracks were wide enough to slip a finger through. At night, she could see stars through the holes in the ceiling. The wind howled through like a living thing, mocking her poverty, her loneliness, her helplessness. Her daughter, Susan, had called yesterday from California. The conversation had been brief, strained. Susan had a family of her own, a busy life, a mortgage that consumed every paycheck. There was always an excuse, always a reason why she could not help, could not visit, could not send even a little money. Martha understood, or at least she told herself she did. She would never be a burden to her only child. The local church had sent someone last month, a young volunteer named David who looked at the cabin with barely concealed pity. He had offered to put her name on a list for emergency housing repairs. That was 6 weeks ago. She had heard nothing since. The waiting list was long, he had said. Very long. Martha rose slowly, her knees protesting with sharp pains that she had learned to ignore. She walked to the small kitchen, little more than a corner with a sink, a 2-burner hot plate, and a refrigerator that hummed and rattled like it might die any moment. She made herself a cup of weak tea, the same bag she had used 3 times already, and returned to her chair by the stove. Through the window, she could see the old barn leaning dangerously to one side. The chicken coop stood empty, the last of the birds sold off 2 years ago when she could no longer afford feed. The garden where she and Robert had grown vegetables was now a tangle of weeds and dead stalks. Everything was falling apart, including her. She thought about her options, which were few and bitter. She could call Susan again, beg for help, and hear the exhaustion and guilt in her daughter's voice. She could wait for the church program that might never come. She could apply for additional assistance, navigate the maze of forms and offices that confused and humiliated her. Or she could simply endure, as she had been doing, wrapped in quilts and prayers, hoping each winter would not be her last. That afternoon, Martha walked into town. The journey took her over an hour, her old boots crunching on the frozen ground. Millbrook was a small place, just a main street with a grocery store, a diner, a post office, and a handful of other businesses barely hanging on. She went to the general store, counting her coins carefully. She needed bread, eggs, and milk. As she walked the aisles, her eyes fell on something unusual, a small display near the back. It was a clearance section, odds and ends nobody wanted. Among the dusty items sat several bags of pottery clay, marked down to 2 cents each. They had been there for months, the store owner trying to clear space. Martha picked up one bag, feeling its weight. Clay. She remembered her grandmother talking about the old ways, how pioneers used to mix clay with straw and mud to seal their cabins. It was called chinking. Her mind began to turn, slowly at first, then with growing clarity. 2 cents. She had 2 cents she could spare. She bought the clay, along with her groceries, and walked home as the sun began to set, painting the Kentucky hills in shades of orange and purple. The bag of clay felt heavy in her hand, but for the first time in months, something besides despair stirred in her chest. It was not hope, not yet, but it was something. A small spark. Possibility. That night, the wind screamed through the cracks as always, but Martha did not pull the quilt tighter. Instead, She stared at the bag of clay sitting on her kitchen counter, and she began to plan. Martha woke before dawn, her body aching from the cold that had settled deep into her bones during the night. She had barely slept, her mind racing with memories and doubt. The bag of clay sat on the counter like a silent challenge, mocking her foolishness. What was she thinking? That a 2-cent bag of clay could solve anything? That her old, arthritic hands could repair what years of neglect had destroyed? She made coffee with yesterday's grounds and stared out the window at the gray morning. The thermometer outside read 23 degrees. Inside felt barely warmer. By mid-morning, she had convinced herself to try. She mixed the clay with water in an old bucket, working it with a wooden spoon until it reached a thick, paste-like consistency. Her hands trembled as she approached the first crack, a wide gap near the window where wind poured through relentlessly. She pressed the clay into the space, smoothing it with her fingers. Felt inadequate, pointless. The crack was too wide, the clay too thin. Within minutes, it began to crumble and fall away in chunks. Martha stood back, watching her feeble attempt fail, and something inside her broke. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and wept. Not the quiet, dignified tears she had shed at Robert's funeral, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of absolute desolation. She was useless, too old, too poor, too broken to fix even the simplest thing. The cabin was dying, and so was she. The crying lasted until she had nothing left. She sat in the silence that followed, numb and empty. Then she heard it, a knock at the door. Weak, hesitant. Martha wiped her face and opened the door to find Mrs. Chun from 3 miles down the road, holding a casserole dish covered in foil. The elderly woman's face registered shock at Martha's appearance. Her red eyes, her defeated posture. "Come in," Martha managed to say, though she wanted nothing more than to be left alone. Mrs. Chun entered, her eyes taking in the cabin, the cracks, the failed clay on the floor, the desperate poverty that Martha had hidden so carefully from everyone. The silence stretched unbearably. "I did not know it was this bad," Mrs. Chun said softly, setting down the casserole. "Martha, why did you not ask for help? Pride is a terrible thing. Keeps you warm when nothing else will, even as it kills you slowly." Martha had worn her pride like armor, refusing charity, refusing pity, refusing to admit that she was drowning. "Cannot," Martha whispered. "I will not be someone's burden." Mrs. Chun looked at her for a long moment, then at the bag of clay, at the bucket, at the crumbling attempt on the wall. She said nothing, but her expression spoke volumes. Pity, sadness, and something else Martha could not quite name. After Mrs. Chun left, Martha stood alone in her cabin, feeling more exposed and humiliated than she had ever felt in her life. Someone knew now. Someone had seen her failure, her poverty, her shame. The wind blew through the cracks, colder than ever. 2 days passed in heavy silence. Martha barely ate, moving through her cabin like a ghost. She expected Mrs. Chun to spread word around Millbrook, expected the pitying looks and whispered conversations that would follow. She braced herself for the humiliation. But on the 3rd morning, something unexpected happened. A truck pulled up outside her cabin, its engine rumbling in the quiet dawn. Martha looked through the window and saw Mr. Peterson, the owner of the hardware store in town, climbing out. Behind him came Mrs. Chun, and then David, the young volunteer from the church. Then came others, people she recognized from town but barely knew. They carried bags, buckets, tools. Martha opened the door, confusion and alarm washing over her. "What is this? What are you doing here?" Mrs. Chun stepped forward first. "I told them about the clay," she said gently, "about what you were trying to do, how you were trying to fix your home with 2 cents worth of clay because you had nothing else." Martha felt heat rise to her face. "I did not ask you to tell anyone. I did not want." Mr. Peterson interrupted, his gruff voice softer than she had ever heard it. "We brought proper chinking compound, Martha, and caulk, and sealant. We are going to help you fix these walls." "I cannot pay you," Martha said, her voice breaking. "I have nothing to give you." David stepped forward, young and earnest. "You do not have to pay us, Mrs. Hayes. This is what neighbors do. This is what community means. Martha wanted to refuse, wanted to send them away, wanted to preserve what little dignity she thought she had left. But as she looked at their faces, she saw no pity there. She saw determination. She saw kindness. She saw people who had decided that her struggle mattered. She stepped aside and let them in. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Mr. Peterson showed Martha the proper way to mix and apply the chinking compound, working it deep into the cracks with a trowel. Mrs. Chun and 2 other women cleaned and repaired what they could. David climbed into the attic to patch the holes in the roof. Martha worked alongside them, her old hands finding new purpose. With each crack they sealed, with each gap they filled, she felt something shift inside her. The walls were not the only things being repaired. By evening, the transformation was remarkable. The wind no longer whistled through. The cabin held warmth. For the first time in years, Martha could breathe without seeing her breath. If you have been moved by Martha's story, if you believe in the power of community and second chances, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Sometimes the smallest gestures, like a 2-cent bag of clay, can start something beautiful. Stay with us, because Martha's journey is far from over. As the volunteers prepared to leave, Martha stood in her newly sealed cabin and felt something she had not felt in 3 long years. Hope. The warmth that night was almost foreign to Martha. She sat by the stove, but for the first time in years, she did not need to huddle beneath multiple quilts. The cabin held heat. The walls stood firm. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, and woke with energy she had forgotten she possessed. Over the following weeks, something shifted not just in her home, but in her life. Mr. Peterson stopped by twice more, bringing wood for her stove and refusing payment. Mrs. Chun invited her to a community dinner at the church, where Martha found herself surrounded by faces that smiled at her, not with pity, but with genuine warmth. David returned with news. The emergency housing repair program had approved her case. But there was more. He had posted about her story on social media, about the widow who tried to seal her cabin with 2 cents worth of clay, and the community that came together to help. The post had gone viral. Martha did not fully understand what viral meant, but she understood the results. Donations began arriving. Small amounts at first, $5 here, $10 there. Then larger sums. People from across Kentucky, then from other states sent money. They sent messages. They sent hope. Within a month, contractors arrived to do major repairs, their work funded by the donations. They fixed the roof properly, replaced rotting boards, installed new windows. The barn was stabilized. The chicken coop was rebuilt, and Mrs. Chun donated 6 laying hens. But the true transformation was not in the structure of wood and nails. It was in Martha herself. She began gardening again, her hands remembering the old rhythms. She started attending church regularly, no longer hiding from the community but embracing it. She called Susan in California, and this time the conversation was different. Martha did not need anything. She just wanted to share her joy. Then came the day that changed everything. A television crew from Louisville arrived, wanting to tell her story for the evening news. Martha was terrified, but David encouraged her. "Your story matters," he said. "It shows people that giving up is never the answer, that communities can heal, that small actions can create miracles." The interview aired on a Thursday evening. Martha watched it at Mrs. Chen's house, surrounded by her new circle of friends. She saw herself on screen, an elderly woman speaking about loneliness, about pride, about the 2-cent bag of clay that became a turning point. She talked about Robert, about the years of struggle, about the moment she broke down and wept on her cabin floor. She talked about the kindness of strangers who became friends. Her voice was steady, her eyes clear. The next morning, her story was picked up by national news outlets. Her phone, which rarely rang, would not stop. Interview requests poured in. More donations arrived. A book publisher called, wanting to tell her story in full. Martha stood in her warm cabin, overwhelmed and amazed, wondering how her life had become this strange and beautiful thing. Spring arrived in Kentucky with an explosion of wildflowers and birdsong. Martha stood in her garden, now flourishing with tomatoes, beans, and squash, and marveled at how different everything looked. The cabin that had once been a crumbling prison now stood solid and beautiful, freshly painted in the same white Robert had chosen decades ago. But the external changes paled in comparison to what had shifted inside her. The book about her life was published in April, a slim volume titled The 2-Cent Miracle. It sold modestly at first, then gained momentum as readers connected with her story of resilience and redemption. Martha did a small book tour, speaking at libraries and community centers across Kentucky and neighboring states. At each stop, people approached her with their own stories of struggle, of isolation, of the moment they almost gave up. She listened to each one, holding their hands, reminding them that darkness always ends, that help often comes from unexpected places, that 2 cents worth of hope is sometimes all you need to start rebuilding. The financial burden that had crushed her for years dissolved completely. The book royalties, combined with the donations that continued to trickle in, gave her security she had never imagined possible. She paid off the property taxes she had been terrified of losing the farm to. She bought a reliable used truck. She could afford her medications without choosing between pills and food. But Martha did something else with the money, something that surprised everyone, including herself. She started a foundation. The Clay Foundation, as she named it, provided emergency home repairs for elderly individuals living in poverty across rural Kentucky. She partnered with local churches, hardware stores, and volunteer organizations. Mr. Peterson became the supplier. David managed the volunteer coordination. Mrs. Chun helped identify families in need. They helped 30 families in the first 6 months. Sealed walls, fixed roofs, restored dignity. Each project began the same way, with Martha visiting the home, sitting with the resident, and telling them about her 2-cent bag of clay, about the night she broke down, about the community that saved her. "You are not alone," she would say, "and you are not a burden. You are worthy of warmth, of safety, of home." Susan flew in from California in June, her first visit since Robert's funeral. She walked through the transformed property with tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I am so sorry," she whispered. "I should have been here. I should have helped." Martha embraced her daughter on the porch where she and Robert used to sit on summer evenings. "You are here now," she said. "That is what matters." They spent a week together, repairing more than just lost time. Susan met the community that had rallied around her mother. She saw the foundation's work firsthand. She understood, finally, that her mother had not just survived. She had become something greater than survival. As Susan's plane lifted off from Louisville, Martha watched from the observation deck and felt complete. The cracks in her life, like the cracks in her cabin walls, had been sealed. Not perfectly, but strongly. Not without effort, but with love. 3 years later, Martha Hayes celebrated her 75th birthday, surrounded by more than 100 people in the Millbrook Community Center. The room overflowed with faces she had come to know and love, the tapestry of community she had helped weave. The Clay Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. They had helped over 200 families across 5 states. The model had been replicated in Tennessee, West Virginia, and Ohio. Churches and civic organizations reached out constantly, wanting to learn how to start similar programs in their communities. Martha no longer lived alone in the cabin, though she still owned it and visited often. She had moved into a small apartment above the foundation's office in town, closer to the work that had become her purpose. The cabin itself had been transformed into a training center where volunteers learned home repair skills, and where families in crisis could stay temporarily while their homes were being fixed. David had become the foundation's full-time director, his youthful energy perfectly balancing Martha's wisdom. Mr. Peterson had retired from the hardware store to work with them. Mrs. Chun ran a support group for isolated seniors, ensuring no one suffered in silence as Martha once had. Susan visited 3 times a year now, sometimes bringing Martha's grandchildren, who loved exploring the old farm and hearing stories about their grandfather Robert. The distance between mother and daughter had closed, replaced by understanding and mutual respect. On this birthday evening, as the cake was brought out and everyone sang, Martha looked around the room and saw the faces of people whose lives had been touched by a 2-cent bag of clay. She saw Mr. Johnson, whose roof they had repaired last winter. She saw the Rodriguez family, whose crumbling farmhouse now stood warm and secure. She saw dozens of volunteers who had discovered their own purpose through service. David stood to make a toast. 3 years ago, he said, a woman tried to fix her broken home with 2 cents worth of clay. She thought she had failed. But what she actually did was show all of us what is possible when we stop hiding our struggles and start building community. Martha did not just seal the cracks in her walls. She sealed the cracks in our hearts. The room erupted in applause. Martha wiped tears from her eyes. Good tears this time. Tears of joy and gratitude. Later that night, she returned to the cabin alone, walking through rooms filled with memories and new purpose. She stood before the wall where she had first pressed that clay, where it had crumbled and fallen, where she had collapsed and wept. A small plaque now hung there, with words she had chosen. Small beginnings, strong foundations. She touched the wall, feeling its solidity, and whispered a prayer of thanks. Thank you for staying with Martha's story until the very end. If this journey moved you, please hit that like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring true stories. What topics would you like us to explore next? Your suggestions help us bring more meaningful content to you. Remember, sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the biggest miracles. Until next time, keep building, keep hoping, keep sealing those cracks with love.